The water did not look like water anymore. It looked like the earth itself had liquefied, a dark, churning mass of mud, broken pine branches, and foam moving with the violence of a collapsing mountain. Elias stood on the elevated bank, his boots sinking an inch into the saturated clay, and listened to the roar of it. 3 days of unbroken rain had turned the Blackwood River from a steady boundary line into a geological event. It tore at the roots of the ancient willows on the far bank, dragging them down into the flood. The air smelled of crushed leaves, wet soil, and the sharp, metallic tang of ozone. He had come out only to check the flood line against his lower pastures, hoping the water hadn't reached the winter wheat. He hadn't expected to find anything living in the current. He almost missed her. In the chaotic tumble of debris and shadowed water, the dark green of her skin blended with the rolling logs and submerged brush. But then, an arm broke the surface. It was a massive, desperate movement, an attempt to find purchase on a slick boulder that the river immediately tore her away from. She went under, swallowed completely by the brown froth, and for a long moment Elias thought that was the end of it. He stood perfectly still, the rain running off the brim of his waxed canvas hat, the cold beginning to seep through his wool coat. The river surged. 10 yards downstream, she broke the surface again. Before I continue, I'd like to make a quick announcement. I'm sharing some really steamy and completely uncensored orc stories on my Patreon page, stories I can't post on YouTube. You can find the details in the description. Just a heads up, the content there is really steamy. Her head thrown back, a ragged, choking gasp barely audible over the roar of the flood. Elias did not waste time unbuttoning his coat. He knew what the water was doing. He knew the temperature of the runoff. A man could freeze in the shallows just as easily as he could drown in the deep. But he also knew the specific geography of this bend in the river. 30 yards down, the water hit a natural choke point of jagged granite before dropping into the lower gorge. If she reached the gorge, she was dead. He started running. The mud sucked at his heels, trying to pull him down, but he kept his weight forward, his eyes locked on the dark shape tumbling through the water. He reached a point where the bank jutted out slightly into the current, anchored by the thick, braided roots of a dead ironwood tree. He didn't pause to calculate the odds. He slid down the steep bank, the clay tearing at his hands, and threw himself waist-deep into the water. The cold was a physical blow. It hit him like a swung hammer, driving the breath from his lungs in a sharp, involuntary hiss. His chest tightened instantly. His legs went numb before he had even taken a full step. The current slammed into his thighs with the weight of a running horse, nearly buckling his knees. He grabbed a thick, exposed root of the ironwood with his left hand, his fingers slipping on the wet bark before finding a knot to hold onto. He braced his boots against a submerged rock, locking his joints, and reached out over the churning water with his right arm. She was coming fast. The river tossed her against a submerged log, and Elias winced at the dull, heavy thud of the impact. But she didn't go under. She was fighting. He could see the sheer scale of her now. She was an orc, and even among her kind, she was enormous. Broad-shouldered, heavily muscled, clad in dark, sodden leather that clung to a frame built for endurance. Her face was bruised, her black hair plastered across her eyes, but she wasn't panicking. Her movements were not the frantic thrashing of a dying animal. They were the calculated, exhausted efforts of someone trying to conserve exactly enough energy to survive the next 10 seconds. "Here!" Elias shouted. He didn't know if she could hear him over the water, but her head snapped toward the sound. She saw him. She saw his outstretched hand. The river tried to pull her toward the center, away from the bank, but she twisted her upper body, fighting the current with a sudden, violent surge of raw strength. She drove her arm forward. Their hands locked. The impact nearly tore Elias's left shoulder from its socket. The sheer mass of her, combined with the momentum of the river, jerked him forward. His boots slipped off the submerged rock. He plunged forward, the freezing water rising to his chest, his mouth filling with the taste of mud and dead leaves. He tightened his grip on the ironwood root with his left hand until his knuckles went white, his tendons screaming under the strain. His right hand clamped down on her wrist. Her forearm was thicker than his calf, the skin slick and cold as riverstone, layered with dense muscle. She didn't rely entirely on him. Her massive hand closed around his forearm, her grip like an iron vice, securing the connection. "Hold!" he grated out, though the word was lost in the noise. For 10 seconds, it was a stalemate. The river raged against them, a physical entity trying to reclaim what it considered its own. Elias's boots slid inches through the mud. The root groaned. His vision blurred at the edges, the cold sapping the heat from his blood, turning his limbs to lead. He focused entirely on the point of contact between their hands. He pulled. Slowly, agonizingly, he pulled his elbow back toward his ribs. She helped him, kicking her heavy legs beneath the water, fighting the drag. Inch by inch, they cut an angle against the current. Elias found a new foothold. He stepped backward, hauling her closer to the bank. The water dropped from her shoulders, revealing thick leather armor scored with fresh, deep scratches. She found the muddy bottom with her own boots, and together they dragged themselves up the steep, slick incline of the bank. They collapsed in the tall, wet grass. Elias rolled onto his back, staring up at the gray, indifferent sky. His chest heaved in ragged, burning gasps. The cold had settled deep in his marrow, making his jaw tremble, but the violent shaking of shock had not yet set in. He lay there for a long time, just listening to the sound of his own breathing, the rain continuing to fall in a steady, drumming rhythm against his soaked clothes. Beside him, the giantess was silent. He turned his head slowly. She was lying on her side, one heavy arm draped over her ribs. She was not coughing. She was not weeping. She was engaged in the methodical, difficult work of forcing oxygen back into her lungs. Water poured off her frame, pooling in the crushed grass beneath her. Her skin was the deep, muted green of shadowed moss, marked with pale, silvery scars along her forearms and the side of her neck. She was easily 7 feet tall, dwarfing Elias entirely. Her facial features were broad and sharp, proud and aristocratic in a rough, heavy way. Small, blunt tusks rested against her lower lip. She opened her eyes. They were the color of dark amber, startlingly clear against the grayness of the afternoon. She looked at the river first, watching the water tear past the bank where she had nearly died. She studied the current for a long moment, her expression unreadable, a quiet assessment of the force that had beaten her. Then she turned her head and looked at Elias. There was no fear in her gaze. There was no immediate outpouring of gratitude. There was only a heavy, weighing intelligence. She looked at his soaked coat, at the mud smeared across his face, at his chest still rising and falling rapidly. She looked at his hands, raw and scraped from the ironwood bark. Elias sat up, his muscles stiffened in protest, a deep, radiating ache settling into his shoulders. He didn't speak. He unbuckled his heavy canvas coat, the stiff material resisting his numb fingers, and slid it off. He held it out to her. She looked at the coat, then at him. She didn't shake her head, but she didn't reach for it either. Slowly, with an immense physical effort that she tried very hard to conceal, she pushed herself up into a sitting position. Her left leg remained straight, the leather of her thigh armor torn where the river had slammed her into something unyielding beneath the surface. She placed a hand on her knee, pressed down slightly, and a subtle tightening at the corners of her eyes was the only indication of pain. She took a deep breath, planted her fists in the mud, and stood up. She towered over him. Even injured, shivering, and soaked to the bone, She possessed a physical presence that demanded the space around her. She looked down at him. "My cabin is a quarter-mile east," Elias said. His voice was hoarse, scraping against his throat. "There is a fire. There is dry wood." He didn't ask if she was all right. He didn't ask how she ended up in the water. Those were questions for people who weren't currently freezing to death in a rainstorm. The giantess gave a single, slow nod. Elias stood. His legs felt heavy as if the water had saturated his bones. He turned and began to walk toward the tree line. He didn't look back to check if she was following. He could hear her footsteps. They were heavy, uneven, a slight drag on the left side, but steady. They walked in silence. The rain fell through the canopy of the pines, cold and persistent. Every step was an exercise in managing discomfort. Elias felt the chill working its way toward his heart, the terrifying, creeping numbness that told a man he was running out of time. He kept his eyes on the ground, picking the easiest path through the roots and brambles, ensuring the terrain was manageable for the massive, limping woman behind him. When the cabin came into view, it was nothing more than a dark, square shape against the gray hillside. A small, single-story structure built of thick, unpeeled logs with a slate roof and a narrow stone chimney. It was not a place of wealth, but it was a place of deep, enduring function. The woodpile against the southern wall was stacked with geometric precision. The hinges on the heavy oak door were oiled. The windows were small, designed to keep the winter cold out rather than let the light in. Elias pushed the door open and stepped aside. She paused on the threshold. She had to duck considerably to pass through the doorframe. Once inside, she stood in the center of the single main room, water dripping from her armor onto the scrubbed floorboards. She did not immediately move toward the hearth. Instead, she stood still, her amber eyes sweeping the room. She looked at the iron stove, the cast iron pans hanging from hooks, the single cot in the corner, the heavy rifle resting above the mantel, the clean, sparse surfaces of the table. She was looking for context. She was deciding what kind of man lived here. Elias moved past her. He didn't hover. He went directly to the hearth, dropping to his knees. The stones were cold. He pulled a handful of dry moss and a few split sections of seasoned birch from the copper bin beside the fireplace. His hands were shaking violently now, the adrenaline wearing off, leaving nothing but the cold. He struck a match against the stone. It broke. He took a breath, steadied his thumb, and struck another. The flame flared, fragile and bright. He touched it to the moss. The smoke curled upward, smelling of old earth, and the fire caught the wood. He stayed there for a moment, feeding larger pieces of oak into the growing flames, letting the heat touch his face. When he finally stood and turned around, she had not moved from the center of the room. She was watching him. Elias walked to the heavy wooden chest at the foot of his cot. He opened it and pulled out a thick, gray wool blanket. He carried it over to her and held it out. She looked at the blanket. Then she reached up and unbuckled the heavy iron clasps at the shoulders of her leather armor. She pulled the sodden material over her head. Beneath it, she wore a thick, dark linen tunic, soaked through and clinging to her heavy musculature. She dropped the armor to the floor. It hit the wood with a heavy, wet thud. She took the blanket from Elias. She didn't wrap it tightly around herself like a frightened traveler. She draped it over her broad shoulders like a mantle, adjusting the weight of it with calm, deliberate movements. "Sit," Elias said, gesturing to the heavy wooden chair beside the hearth. She walked over and sat down. The chair creaked ominously beneath her weight, but it held. She extended her legs toward the fire. The heat began to fill the small room, fighting back the dampness. Elias moved to the small kitchen area. He pumped water into an iron kettle and set it over the stove. He moved methodically, letting the routine of the chores ground him. He stripped off his soaked coat and shirt, dropping them into a tin basin, and pulled a dry flannel shirt from a peg on the wall. The rough fabric felt like a luxury against his skin. He sliced thick cuts of salt pork and dropped them into an iron skillet, adding a handful of dried beans and a measure of water. The sizzle and pop of the fat filled the quiet room. Throughout it all, they did not speak. The silence was not uncomfortable. It was the heavy, necessary silence of two people who had just survived something violent and were currently engaged in the singular task of continuing to survive. When the food was ready, Elias filled 2 tin plates. He carried one to her, along with a thick slice of dense, dark bread, and set it on the small table next to her chair. He took his own plate and sat on the wooden stool opposite the hearth. She ate methodically. She didn't gorge herself, despite the obvious physical toll her body had taken. She cut the tough salt pork with a small, bone-handled knife she produced from her belt, chewing slowly, staring into the flames. Elias watched her hands. They were the size of dinner plates, the knuckles thick and heavily calloused. They were the hands of someone who had spent a lifetime holding weapons, hauling ropes, working stone. There was a precision to her movements that contrasted sharply with her massive size. She finished her plate and set it down. She looked across the fire at Elias. "The river," she said. Her voice was a deep, resonant baritone, rough like grinding stones, but her pronunciation of the human tongue was exact, formal, and lacking any regional accent. "It was higher than the maps indicated. It's been raining for 3 days," Elias said quietly. "The mountain runoff funnels into the gorge. It rises 10 feet in an hour." She gave a slow nod, absorbing the information. "A tactical error on my part. I attempted a crossing at the Narrows. The bank gave way." She stated it simply, as a matter of fact. A failure of logistics, not a plea for sympathy. "The water is fast there," Elias agreed. He took a sip of the hot chicory coffee he had poured, feeling the warmth finally settling into his stomach. "It takes horses under." "It took my horse," she said. She looked back at the fire, the flames reflected in her amber eyes, making them look like molten gold. "I held the rocks for an hour. Then the roots broke." Elias thought about the sheer physical endurance required to hold against that current for an hour. It was impossible. Yet she sat in front of him. "My name is Elias," he said. She turned her massive head. She studied him again, that same weighing intelligence parsing through his quiet demeanor, his worn clothes, the calluses on his own hands. "I am Morana," she said. She offered nothing else. No clan name, no explanation of why she was traveling alone near the human borderlands, no details of her destination. Elias didn't ask. He understood the rules of the border. You didn't push for history until it was offered. "There is a cot in the corner," Elias said, gesturing with his cup. "It's narrow, but the blankets are dry. Sleep. I'll watch the fire." Morana looked at the cot. Then she looked at him. She didn't argue. She stood up, the wool blanket still draped across her shoulders, and walked to the corner of the room. She lay down on the small cot, her legs hanging off the end, her massive frame making the bed look like a child's toy. She turned her face to the wall. Within 5 minutes, the deep, steady rhythm of her breathing told Elias she was asleep. Elias sat by the fire for a long time. He listened to the rain on the slate roof. He watched the embers pulse and fade, glowing bright orange when the draft hit them, subsiding into gray ash. He thought about the river. He thought about the sheer weight of her hand in his. He added another log to the fire, the wood snapping sharply in the quiet room, and let the night pass. When Elias woke, the fire had burned down to a pile of glowing red dust. The gray light of dawn was filtering through the small windows, painting the cabin in muted, cold tones. The rain had finally stopped. He sat up, his shoulders aching sharply. He looked toward the corner. The cot was empty. The gray wool blanket was folded with rigid mathematical precision, resting exactly in the center of the mattress. Elias stood and walked to the door. It was unlatched. He stepped out onto the porch. The air was frigid, biting at his face, smelling clean and sharp after the storm. The mud in the yard was heavily disturbed, massive boot prints leading away from the cabin, cutting straight across the pasture toward the eastern tree line. She had not taken a horse. She had simply walked out into the cold morning, injured leg and all, returning to whatever mission the river had interrupted. He walked back inside. He moved toward the table to begin the morning routine, grinding coffee, stoking the stove. He stopped. Resting in the center of the scrubbed pine table, positioned exactly where his plate had been the night before, was a stone. Elias picked it up. It was heavier than it looked, roughly the size of a plum, cold against his palm. It was raw, uncut, and unpolished. At first glance it looked like a piece of dark, jagged flint, but as he turned it in the gray morning light, the interior of the stone caught the faint illumination. Deep inside the jagged exterior, a rich veins of luminous emerald green pulsed, intricate and fractal, like frozen moss trapped in ice. It was a rough emerald, massive and completely raw, broken directly from the earth. Elias stared at it for a long time. He ran his thumb over the sharp, unworked edges.
It was not a coin. It was not a piece of crafted jewelry. It was a fragment of a mountain. He set it down on the mantel above the hearth where the firelight could catch it, and went out to feed the animals. The day passed with the slow, heavy rhythm of farm labor. Elias repaired the fencing along the lower pasture, his muscles burning from the exertion, the cold wind whipping across the open fields. He checked the soil, measured the flood line, and split a cord of wood to replace what he had burned the night before. He didn't think much about the Giantess. He had lived alone on the borderlands for 15 years. People came, people suffered, people left. The silence always returned. He had built his life around that silence. But occasionally, when he paused to wipe the sweat from his brow, he would look toward the eastern tree line, where her tracks disappeared into the deep woods. The sun began to dip below the western ridge, casting long, stretching shadows across the grass. The sky turned a bruised, deep purple. Elias was standing by the water pump, washing the dirt from his hands when he felt it. It wasn't a sound at first. It was a vibration, a low, rhythmic trembling in the earth that traveled up through the soles of his boots. He turned the pump handle off. The water splashed against the stones, then stopped. He listened. It was the sound of iron-shod hooves, many of them. But it wasn't the chaotic, uneven clatter of a merchant caravan, nor was it the hurried, scattered drumming of raiders. This sound was unified. It was a slow, deliberate march, a cadence maintained with absolute, terrifying discipline. It was the sound of a force that had nothing to fear and was in no rush to arrive. Elias dried his hands on a rag and walked slowly toward the front porch of his cabin. He stood on the steps, his thumbs hooked loosely into his belt, and watched the southern road. They emerged from the twilight shadows of the pines like statues coming to life. Orcs. 24 of them, riding massive, heavy-boned war horses that looked more like draft animals than cavalry mounts. The riders wore dark iron and boiled leather, their armor matte and oiled, designed for function, not display. They rode in a double column, their posture relaxed but universally alert, heavy axes and broadswords resting in scabbards at their saddles. They did not speak. The only sounds were the breathing of the horses, the creak of thick leather, and the heavy thud of hooves on the packed dirt road. At the head of the column rode a single figure. If Marana had been massive, the rider at the front was a monolith. He was older, his black hair heavily streaked with iron gray, pulled back into a tight, thick braid. His face was a map of old violence. Deep, pale scars crisscrossed his jaw, his cheek, the bridge of his wide nose. He wore an immense mantle of dark, heavy fur over armor that looked thick enough to stop a cannonball. His sheer physical bulk made the massive warhorse beneath him look almost normal-sized. The column halted in the center of Elias's yard. They did not spread out. They did not surround the cabin. They stopped in perfect formation, maintaining a respectful distance. The leader dismounted. He didn't jump down. He swung his heavy leg over the saddle and dropped to the ground with a thud that Elias felt in his chest. The giant orc handed his reins to the rider beside him. He unbuckled his massive broadsword from his hip, entirely disarming himself, and handed the weapon to the same rider. Then he walked toward the porch. Elias did not move. He kept his hands away from his sides, his posture calm, showing neither aggression nor submission. He simply watched the mountain of a man approach. The orc stopped at the bottom of the porch steps. He looked at Elias. His eyes were the same striking molten amber as Marana's, though lined with the heavy weight of decades. He looked at the cabin, at the chopped wood, at the mended fences, and finally back to Elias. "You are Elias," the orc said. His voice was a deep, rumbling, tectonic shift. The human words were pronounced with careful, heavy precision. "I am," Elias said. The orc placed his massive hands on his belt. "I am Kalen, chieftain of the Blackridge bloodline." He paused, the silence stretching out between them, thick and heavy as the twilight air. "You pulled my daughter from the water." "I pulled a woman from the water," Elias corrected quietly. The river didn't care who her father was. Kalen's amber eyes narrowed slightly. It wasn't in anger. It was a microscopic shift in expression that suggested he was recalibrating his assessment of the human standing before him. The chieftain let out a slow, heavy breath through his nose. "No," Kalen agreed. "The river does not care. The river is blind. But I am not." Kalen stepped up onto the porch. The wooden planks groaned violently beneath his weight, but the chieftain moved with a surprising, quiet grace. He did not ask permission to sit. He simply turned and lowered his massive frame onto the heavy wooden bench Elias had built against the cabin wall. He rested his elbows on his knees, clasping his scarred hands together, and stared out across the darkening fields. Elias turned and leaned against the porch railing, facing him. The 24 warriors in the yard remained perfectly still, shadows deepening around them as the night came on. "Marana is my only living heir," Kalen said, his voice dropping an octave, becoming softer, though no less heavy. "She crossed the river alone to scout the movements of human mercenaries gathering near our borders. She does not take escorts when she scouts. She believes stealth is broken by numbers." He paused, looking down at his hands. "She is a warrior. She does not fear death in battle. But to drown, to be swallowed by the mud, unremembered and unseen." Kalen stopped. He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. The silence carried the weight of a father's terror, a terror he was not allowed to show his clan, but one he permitted this human to witness in the dark. Kalen reached beneath his heavy fur mantle. He unhooked a thick, worn leather satchel from his side. He lifted it and set it down on the small wooden table between them. The satchel landed with a heavy, dense clunk that sounded like stones hitting wood. Elias looked at the bag. He didn't reach for it. "When humans speak of wealth," Kalen said, his amber eyes locking onto Elias, "they speak of coins, small, stamped pieces of gold and silver. They trade them for bread, for horses, for blood. They use them to build walls and hire killers. Human wealth is fluid. It moves. It has no loyalty." Kalen reached out and untied the thick leather cord binding the satchel. He pulled the heavy hide flaps back, revealing the interior. The faint light spilling from the cabin window caught the contents.
Inside the bag were stones, dozens of them. None of them were cut, none of them were polished to fit into a nobleman's ring or a queen's necklace. They were raw, jagged chunks of the earth. Deep, violent rubies the size of walnuts, sapphires still crusted with gray bedrock, veins of pure, unsmelted gold threaded through chunks of dark quartz, and emeralds, rough and heavy, identical to the one resting on Elias's mantle. It was a fortune. It was a king's hoard. If a man took this bag to a city, he could buy ships, estates, armies. He could disappear into absolute luxury for the rest of his natural life. Elias looked at the stones. He felt no sudden rush of greed, no spike of adrenaline. He felt only the immense, crushing gravity of what sat on his table. "We do not mine for trade," Kalen continued softly. "When a child of the Blackridge comes of age, they are sent deep into the mountain. They strike the stone. What they break loose, they keep. It is a reminder that the earth is older than our blood, and it will remain long after our bones are dust. These stones are not currency, Elias. They are time. They are the physical weight of my ancestors' labor. They represent the blood, the breath, and the survival of my lineage." Kalen pulled his hand back from the satchel. He sat up straight, his massive shoulders broad against the timber wall of the cabin. "You did not just save a life," the chieftain said, his voice echoing with absolute, solemn finality. "You saved the future of my bloodline. You saved the leader my people will need when the long winter comes. I cannot pay you for that. Payment implies a debt that can be settled and forgotten." Kalen gestured to the bag. "I do not bring you payment. I bring you an equal weight. You carry the burden of our future. I give you the weight of our past." Elias looked from the bag to Kalen's face. The chieftain's expression was stoic, impenetrable, but the intensity in his eyes was absolute. This was not a reward. This was an anchoring. It was a cultural exchange of soul weight, a tether binding the human's quiet life to the heavy, violent history of the mountain clan. Elias let out a slow breath. The cold air plumed in front of his face. He looked out at the 24 warriors, silent and watchful in the yard. He looked at his small, empty cabin. For 15 years he had owned nothing but the dirt under his boots and the quiet in his head. "It is a heavy thing to give a man," Elias said quietly. "It is a heavy thing to pull a giant from the river," Kalen replied. Elias reached out. He rested his hand on the rough, worn leather of the satchel. He didn't look at the gems. He felt the coarse hair of the hide, the cold edge of a stone pressing against the fabric. He gave a single, slow nod. "I will keep it safe," Elias said. Kalen's shoulders dropped a fraction of an inch. It was the only physical manifestation of the immense relief the chieftain felt. The honor had been accepted properly. The weight was balanced. Kalen stood up. The bench creaked as the pressure was removed. He looked down at Elias. "We make camp in the lower pasture tonight. Tomorrow, we ride for the mountain. The border is becoming unsafe." The chieftain paused, looking at the cabin door. "You have no clan, Elias. A man with stones of the deep earth will find enemies quickly if he stands alone." "I have stood alone a long time," Elias said. "A tree stands alone," Kalen said gently, "until the wind blows hard enough. The Blackridge does not forget its anchors. If the wind comes to your door, send word. The mountain will answer." Kalen turned and walked down the steps. He approached his warriors. He spoke a single, harsh syllable in the orcish tongue. The column moved. They turned their horses with practiced, fluid grace, moving down the road toward the lower pasture to make camp. Elias stayed on the porch. He didn't take the satchel inside immediately.
He stood in the dark, listening to the sounds of the war band settling in the distance, the soft clinking of iron, the low murmur of deep voices, the smell of wood smoke drifting up from the valley. He felt a profound shift in the air, a fundamental change in the geometry of his isolated life. He picked up the satchel. It was incredibly heavy, demanding a firm grip. He carried it inside, closed the heavy oak door, and set the bag on the table. He didn't open it again. He knew what was inside. He lit the oil lamp, the yellow glow pushing back the shadows, and sat in his chair by the cold hearth. An hour later, there was a sound on the porch. It wasn't a knock, it was the distinct, heavy creak of the wooden floorboards accepting an immense weight. Elias did not reach for his rifle. He remained in his chair. He watched the door. The latch clicked. The door pushed open slowly. Marana stood in the frame. She had changed. She was no longer wearing the heavy utilitarian leather of a border scout. She wore a long sleeveless tunic of deep midnight blue wool, trimmed with thick wolf fur at the collar. Her left leg was tightly bound in clean linen bandages beneath the hem of the tunic. Her black hair was clean, brushed back and held at the nape of her neck by a heavy silver clasp. The bruises on her face were dark, but she carried herself with an easy, fluid grace that the river had temporarily stolen from her. She stepped inside and closed the door behind her with a soft click. She looked at the room. She looked at the satchel resting on the table. Finally, she looked at Elias. "My father speaks with the weight of stones," Marana said quietly. "He is a serious man," Elias replied, remaining seated. "He is a terrified father," she corrected, stepping further into the room. She moved toward the hearth, her massive frame taking up the space, making the cabin feel instantly smaller, yet oddly warmer. "He believes he nearly lost his lineage. He believes you returned it to him." "I just held on to a hand," Elias said. Marana stopped near the mantel. She looked at the raw emerald resting there, the stone she had left that morning. She reached out and touched it lightly with her thick, scarred fingertip. "A hand is a heavy thing to hold when the water is trying to tear it away," she said. She turned her head, looking down at him. The amber in her eyes caught the lamplight. "I was tired, Elias. When the root broke and I went into the gorge water, I was tired. I thought about the mountain. I thought about the cold. I thought, let the water have it." She confessed it softly, her voice barely above a whisper. It was an admission of vulnerability that she would never have spoken to her father, nor to her warriors. It was a secret kept between two people who knew exactly how cold the bottom of a river felt. "And then you saw me," she continued. "You didn't shout a warning. You didn't throw a rope. You stepped into the dark water. You made yourself heavy so that I would not drown alone." Elias looked at his hands. The scrapes on his knuckles were raw, stinging in the dry air. He didn't have poetry to offer her. He didn't have grand speeches. He only had the grounded reality of what had happened. "I couldn't watch you go under," Elias said simply. That's all it was. Marana moved toward the heavy wooden chair opposite him. She sat down. She was close enough now that he could smell the clean scent of the cold wind on her clothes, mixed with the faint, sharp smell of pine sap. She rested her elbows on her knees, leaning forward slightly, bringing her face closer to his level. "You accepted the stones," she said. "I accepted the weight," Elias corrected gently. Marana's lips parted slightly, a quiet exhalation of breath. The correction pleased her. It told her that he understood the language of her people, not the words, but the intent behind them. "My father offered you protection," she said, her voice dropping into a low, resonant hum. "He told you the mountain would answer if you called." "He did." "He speaks for the clan," Marana said, holding his gaze. The air between them felt suddenly thick,
charged with the slow, inevitable pressure of a shifting tide. I speak for myself. She reached out. She didn't grab his hand. She simply placed her massive, scarred hand on the armrest of his chair, her knuckles inches from his. The physical proximity was deliberate. It was a bridging of the space between them, quiet and immense.
"The border is changing, Elias," she said, her eyes tracing the lines of his face, noting the gray in his beard, the exhaustion around his eyes, the steady calm that defined him. "The silence you keep here, it will not last. The raiders will come, the storms will come."
"I know," Elias said.
"When they do,"
Marana said softly, her thumb brushing lightly against the worn wood of the chair,
"do not stand alone in the rain."
Elias looked at her hand. He looked at the scars, the thick veins, the sheer power resting so gently near his own skin. He thought about the empty years. He thought about the silence of the cabin, a silence that had felt like a shield but was perhaps only a cage. He looked back up into her amber eyes. "If the storms come," Elias said, his voice quiet, steady, "I know the way to the mountain." Marana's expression didn't shift into a smile, but the hard, stoic lines of her face softened completely. The tension in her broad shoulders melted away. She didn't pull her hand back. She left it there, resting near his, a silent, heavy promise anchored in the quiet room. They sat together for a long time as the oil lamp burned low, neither of them feeling the need to fill the space with words, listening to the wind move through the pines, the raw gems resting heavy on the table, and the cold river continuing to rush violently in the dark far away, unable to touch them anymore.